Hi, we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us today. Hi, everyone. My name is Katia, and we're really grateful that you all can join us today during your lunch hour. So please go ahead and feel free to enjoy your snack or your meal as you enjoy and participate in the session today. And please let us know where you're joining from in the chat. Introduce yourself, give us your name, your organization, and what part of California you're joining from.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ismael Herrera, Director of Regional Stewardship for California Forward. I appreciate you all being here. Buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por estar aquí con nosotros en este día. I want to just go over some quick housekeeping items before we launch into our program, and I pass it over to my colleague Ana Vidales to provide some instructions. As you probably noticed, there's a little red button at the top of your screen that's red. That means we're recording this session for the purposes of making this session today available to those folks who weren't able to join us today but want to hear the content and follow along. And so we are recording this session. I'll ask that when you're not speaking, if you could help us keep your mics muted so that we don't capture the ambient noise, such as the little children that are in my background. We can try to keep the recording as clear as possible for others. Continue to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, organization, the county that you're calling in from. We'd love to see who's here with us today. And then along the way, submit your questions using the chat también. Drop them in there. Ask away as we proceed through the slides. There'll be a dedicated time on the agenda for questions, but you're always welcome to drop them in the chat. As we'll get to here in a second, this session is being provided in English and in Español también. And so we'll get to some instructions on how you can access the traducción en español, si la preferencia es tenerlo en español. And when you have a chance, if you haven't done so already, just download the Zoom link that's there on your screen so that you can participate in the breakout discussions as well. So baje la aplicación que está allí en la pantalla para que pueda participar en las discusiones que vamos a tener en el programa en unos momentos con grupos más pequeños. Entonces, con eso le doy el micrófono aquí virtual a mi compañera Ana.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Ana Vidales, and I'm going to be your interpreter this day. So if you want to hear Spanish interpretation, all you have to do is you have to go to the icon that says interpretation, and you pick English. There's an option that says mute original audio. If you pick that, then you're just going to hear the interpreter, and you're not going to hear the speaker. If you leave it open, you're going to hear the interpreter at an 80% and the speaker at a 20%. If you're joining through a phone or an iPad, you have to go to the three little dots that say more. And then you pick your language and then you pick done. Buenas tardes, yo soy Ana Vidales, voy a ser su intérprete esta tarde. Y para poder acceder a lo que es la interpretación en español, ustedes van a ver al fondo de su pantalla un pequeño icono del globo mundial que dice interpretación. Ustedes tienen que dar clic ahí, elegir el español y pueden ustedes elegir cerrar audio original o mute original audio y solo van a escuchar al intérprete. Si lo dejan abierto, van a escuchar al intérprete a un 80% y al ponente a un 20%. Si están ustedes por medio de un teléfono o un iPad, tienen que ir a los tres puntitos donde dice more y eligen su idioma. Y lo mismo aplica en cuanto a mute original audio. Muchas gracias.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Eduardo Garcia. I am a Senior Policy Manager at the Latino Community Foundation. I want to welcome everyone and thank you so much for making the time today to join us for today's webinar to learn all about CERF, the Community Economic Resilience Fund. Just really briefly about myself, again, Senior Policy Manager at the Latino Community Foundation, which many of you already know. The Latino Community Foundation exists to unleash the civic and economic power of Latinos in California. And we believe that this opportunity that we have before us, CERF, is an opportunity to make sure that Latinos are a part of the conversation moving forward as California works to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and correct some of the economic inequities that were highlighted during the pandemic, but as we all know, were always there, sort of in the background. So before we dive into some content, I want to open it up to today's facilitators I'm going to ask for folks to briefly introduce themselves so that we can get started on the content since we have a pretty tight agenda today. So Micah, would you like to go first?
Sure. Michael Weinberg, CEO, California Forward, calling in from Oakland.
I'm Katia Ramos here at LCF, and I'm calling in from Oakland, California.
Everybody, you're going to hear enough from me, so I'll be brief. I'm calling in here from Fresno County, specifically Kerman.
Hi, everyone. I'm Annalisa Saragar-Worm, calling in from Riverside, California today. Good to meet you all. I'm a project manager with California Forward.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. And Katia, do you want to go briefly over the agenda for today and the objectives we're going to achieve?
Yeah, of course. So just really briefly, today's session is going to be an opportunity for you all to learn more about CERF, ask questions, and converse with community partners. To the right, you'll see what our objectives are for this session. So really, we want to make sure that we're supporting the Latino community's ongoing equitable COVID-19 recovery efforts by sharing more about opportunities for economic development like CERF. Want to build awareness and understanding of the state CERF program. So we want to make sure that you all leave this session informed and ready to engage in CERF in a way that's beneficial for our Latino communities. We want to begin the conversation about how to connect and engage. So we'll start off with giving you a little bit of context about how COVID has impacted the Latino community. The team at California will then do a quick, short economic development 101, and you'll learn more about what that is and what it looks like in your communities. And then we'll do a brief CERF overview. We'll go into some Q&A for those of you that have questions. I know that a lot of you have expressed like, what is CERF? What does that even mean? So we're here to answer your questions. And then we'll go into breakout rooms by region. So we have folks representing Northern California, Southern California, the Central Coast, and the Central Valley. And then we'll close at the end with some follow-up and what's next for us in terms of CERF.
Excellent. So we're going to start today's webinar by getting grounded in some of the things that we already know in this group about the Latino worker and some of the impacts that the Latino worker, the average Latino worker, experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Which obviously these issues rose to the surface throughout the pandemic, but were really always sort of present in the background. And the pandemic obviously just elevated some of these issues. We want to start by underscoring these points because as the state of California works to create a more equitable and inclusive economy statewide, it's important for us to have a base and to really internalize some of the lessons and some of the learnings that we observed during the pandemic when it comes to the Latino worker and how the California economy is and maybe isn't working for many California Latinos. And so one of the things that really rose to the surface, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, was around industry representation, right? So Latinos, as many of you already know, are overrepresented in essential industries, right? And that means that only about 1 in every 6 Latino workers was able to work from home, which means that they were on the front lines throughout the pandemic and putting themselves at risk, right? Especially in the beginning when we were still learning a lot about the coronavirus and what health impacts it could potentially have. Obviously, this resulted in some pretty disastrous health outcomes. To date, the state has registered approximately 38,000 California Latino deaths due to COVID-19. Something else that we learned about the Latino worker throughout the pandemic had to do with healthcare access. So only about 1/3 of California's Latino workers is able to access healthcare from their employer, right? So that means that many individuals are then forced to seek out healthcare in the private market, right? Which we know can sometimes be very costly. This contributes to a lack of access, a lack of healthcare access for Latinos. In fact, there's another data point that I wanted to mention. About 2/3 of the state's uninsured population is Latino, right? So there are many folks that currently don't have coverage. And we know that in the future, as we rebuild a more equitable, inclusive economy, that should include jobs that provide healthcare access to workers, including Latino workers. I know that Katya has some comments to make around the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic had on Latinas in particular. Katya?
Yeah, so, and when we talk about the impact that COVID has had on the Latino community, we have to highlight that it has had a great impact on Latinas specifically. The major point that we want to note is that employment for Latinas fell more than 3 times the decline in the unemployment for white men. And studies have shown that Latinas were more likely to drop out of the workforce than any other group. And this is due to so many reasons, but to name a few, like Eduardo mentioned, Latinas specifically are overrepresented in industries that were high touch during the pandemic. So that's like retail, hospitality. We see a lot of Latinas working in those spaces that were unemployed as a result of the economic downturn during the pandemic. And Latinas also tend to have far more responsibility when it comes to familial obligations, as they are the primary caregivers in comparison to their Latino counterparts. And also a lack of access to affordable childcare, education, and training opportunities exacerbate this issue. So we also want to note that Latinas earn 42 cents on every dollar earned by a white man. This is the largest pay gap in the country, and it continues to widen since 2011. And I know these are data points that we're all pretty familiar with, but we wanted to bring these up again as we talk about how we can help our communities rebuild in the next couple of years.
Yes, thank you, Katya. That's a great segue into looking ahead, right? And it's, again, why it's so important that we're all on this call learning about CERF because it represents an opportunity for Latinos in particular to be a part of the conversation that can help create a more equitable and fair economy that works for everybody. We know that one of the potential challenges moving forward is automation. Latino and Black workers in particular are overrepresented in jobs that are likely to be impacted by automation moving forward. And so again, as the state recovers from the pandemic, there is one opportunity for Latino to ensure that their voices are being included in this process, to ensure that we are really, taking into consideration some of the lessons that we've learned throughout the pandemic, and that we're on a road to building a more equitable economy that means that Latinos have access to higher paying jobs that offer healthcare and that are not being made vulnerable to automation moving forward. So now that we're sort of grounded in what some of the issues are, some of the problems that we're diagnosing within the California economy when it comes to Latino workers, I want to hand it over now to my colleague Micah, who will talk a little bit more about regional inclusive economic development. Micah?
Yeah, thank you so much, Eduardo and Katya, the whole crew. Could talk about this for 3 hours, going to talk about it for just a couple of minutes, but just to kind of level set for folks. Because people hear economic development, and I think understandably, they think, oh, that's, bringing a big box store to my community, or that's, bringing some sort of, call center with a variety of low wage jobs. Maybe that's some of the jobs that Eduardo talked about where, they're more subject to automation. Maybe it's some of the situation that Katya talked about where, there's going to be this real big pay differential. Regional inclusive economic development is about doing things differently. And it's in particular about creating and executing strategies together to create more high-paying and promising jobs. And those jobs will create social equity. And then in particular for this program and for California Forward and our partners, also environmental sustainability. We don't think you need to trade off across those. We think that you need to be able to promote economic opportunity, environmental sustainability, and racial and social equity. It is also different than conventional economic development in that instead of folks just finding out what happened after it was all done, they are brought to the table at the beginning to help create these strategies, learn about what's going on in their economies, really have some agency in what sorts of jobs do we want to attract here, what's reasonable, what kind of skill sets do we have, and so on. And they do this in collaboration with a lot of other actors that are active in this space. So, you know, cities and counties are extremely active in economic development. In fact, most active in economic development in California specifically. The business community, the workforce development system, community colleges, community groups, you name it, coming together to decide what it is that we can do together to create an economy that is more equitable, economy that is more environmentally sustainable, but really importantly, not just to put together a plan. There are a lot of reports that have been written talking about, you know, sort of admiring the problem. This is about really tackling those major issues that we've been highlighting today and moving forward on them. So it's really different from a lot of conventional economic development in that way. And you'll hear more details about the program from my colleague Ish in just a minute. But what I want to say, just to conclude here, is this is a huge opportunity for us. We're going to be talking about the CERF program, but there are lots of different money that is flowing from the federal government, from the state government, across a range of different programs that are increasingly adopting this model. Because none of this is going to work if it's a flash in the pan. Equity is not going to happen if we focus on it for 1 year. This needs to be a sustained effort. This needs to be a collective effort. It needs to have everybody at the table. The private sector needs to be bought in. The public sector needs to be bought in so that we can really see different outcomes for people across the state. So that's it for me, and I'll hand it over to my colleague Ish to talk a little bit more about CERF specifically.
Great, thank you, Micah, Eduardo, and Katia. I want to just start off by giving a very important point here, which is the Community Economic Resiliency Fund is not a program of the Latino Community Foundation of California Forward. This is a state program. Our two organizations are partnering here today to do what we think is an important step, which is to provide the latest and greatest on the program to a broad set of stakeholders and all of you, with the hopes that we can get you up to speed on where this program is currently, and more importantly, get you plugged into the work moving forward. And so with that, I'm going to take a few minutes just to give a high-level overview of the program. I encourage outreach to us after today's event, questions in the chat, and we'll give you some more information later on how to circle back with us with everything that we're providing here today. I also want to just caveat this by saying that a lot of this is still TBD. The state is in the process of completing its final set of guidelines for this program. So what I'm presenting here today is what we know up to date from the state as it pertains to the program, its various nuances. First and foremost, this is an opportunity, as Micah mentioned, that's available for all our regions. There is a substantial amount of money being made available to every region in an initial phase, which is phase 1, that we're in the process of waiting for final guidelines from the state on. And then there's a second phase, which with the broader set of resources that'll become available, we're anticipating later this year, early next year. But the state ultimately has a few things that it wants to accomplish with these resources. You've heard from Eduardo and Katia about the importance of making sure equitable social economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic is taking shape in every one of our regions. With the most vulnerable in mind. They want to make sure that there's a set of living documents, as Micah alluded to, plans that don't just sit on a shelf, but the plans that are implementable, that are being resourced through a hodgepodge of funding, and tackling the priorities and the challenges that are being surfaced by a broad set of stakeholders through the initial planning phase process. We want to make sure, as Micah mentioned, we're leveraging as much to the degree possible a set of very diverse resources that are out there that are taking this model and running with it more actively. And we want to make sure that we hear from all of you and the constituents that you all represent in the process, so that these plans in every region have not just the voices and the fingerprints, but the decision-making and the buy-in from the folks that we know are the intended beneficiaries of a lot of this work. And so with that, we'll move into the next slide and talk to you a little bit about where the regions are. You are all here from different parts of the state. This is how the regions, the final breakdown from the state has come down on what the regions are. You'll see that each of you represent probably a geography that fits within the space, and some of you probably represent geographies that overlap across these regions. That's okay too. We encourage you to get involved to the degree that you're able to in the different regions that your respective organizations, your constituents represent in this map. And so you can visit that website there. That's listed on the slide for more specifics on each of the regions. The next slide that I'm going to talk to you about briefly is offering a timeline, a current timeline based on what we've heard most recently from the state of California. We're in the month of April. We are anticipating that a second set of guidelines for public comment and input from all of you will be made available for you all to provide recommendations, suggestions, concerns. That'll be something that'll be available for the second time in this process. And then as released earlier this week, the state will be hosting an additional set of public workshops in each of the regions that were outlined in the map to provide additional touch points to all of you and your stakeholders and your networks to provide input into the process for the state as well. We anticipate that in late May, early June, the final guidelines for phase 1 of the funding will be made available to every region to apply and solicit the funding that is at the $5 million level for the initial phase, which is meant to bring together cross-sector stakeholders to provide that planning document that will then be available for implementation with further additional resources. And then you see there the availability of the awards being, the selection of the awards being made later this summer, early fall. We'll move into the next slide and touch quickly on this idea of coming together. That's really what we're trying to advocate here for, that you be involved at a cross-sector table that brings different set of sectors, priorities, ways of thinking together in a central table, and that it has all these folks listed here to the left involved. Not only these folks, but other folks as well, those that you represent. We want to make sure that you're all part of these collaborative tables that are being set in these different regions, so that there's we know there will only be one application, one collaborative selected per each of those 13 regions by the state with the funding to be able to generate those plans that'll then be available for implementation dollars later. To the right there, you see who is available, who is eligible to be the applicant and fiscal sponsor in each of those regions to take the lead on the application process. What we really want to emphasize here is that we want to have a cross set of organizations, community-based organizations, organizations that you all represent with the populations, the demographics that we know need to be kept in mind for this process involved. We encourage you to reach out and engage in each of the regions in the tables that are in the process of being organized, to make sure that you have a seat at the table to provide the input, the insight, and the connections to the communities that you all represent. So that togetherness and that connection is really vital here. Next slide. We will just offer you a quick overview of how California Forward will continue to be available to support the efforts of the regions and all of you who want to engage and connect. There's just an overview of what we will be on hand, willing and able and ready to deploy from our end through our team to support the regional processes as they come together. And that includes making sure that we work with those of you who want to engage, that you're connected to the right places in each of those regions. And so to the degree that we can be of support to you, please reach out and let us know how we can facilitate that engagement and that connection for you and your networks. With that, I want to pause here and leave it open for some questions. I think we have a few minutes to take some Q&A, and you can certainly submit them via chat or come off mute and ask them directly. We have, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 10 minutes. Yeah, we have about 5 minutes allotted for questions here, so we can take a few of them, and then we're going to go into the next step in the agenda. But anybody have a question that you want to surface now? I'm going to look at the chat to see who's maybe asking there, but come off mute if you want to ask something as well. I know there's a lot to take in there, a lot of information, a short amount of time, but anything that surfaces that comes to mind. And Eduardo and Katia, that includes you as well. Pat, I see you have your hand up. Why don't you come off mute and ask your question? And I'm going to invite my colleague Micah to help field some of these as we go. Pat?
Okay. Perfect. So you're awarding one grant per the region per 13 regions, correct? Is that?
Let me just clarify. The state of California is awarding. We have no say in the decision-making of who gets them and who does not. But the state will award 1 grant for each of those 13 regions that you saw on that map.
Okay, so all the participating organizations within that region, we need to collaborate. Is that how?
That is the hope and dream.
Okay.
And I also want to answer the question in the chat. So it's 1 grant, about $5 million for each of 13 regions for planning. There will then be an unknown number of grants, that could be sub-regional, could be multi-regional, to actually implement those projects. And we're going to get more information about that from the state. But yes, for the planning grant purposes itself, there's going to be just 1 table. And so there's another question in the chat from Jenny about how might we learn what entities might be applying for a grant in a given region. And we've begun to, the final guidelines aren't out and there isn't an RFP yet, but we've really begun to take the pulse of regions. And there are some regions where it seems like, a pretty inclusive table is coming together. And we're also encouraging the state to do everything they can to make it transparent who is, planning to and applying for these grants. But the punchline is we and Latino Community Foundation, other folks that we've been working with in this space, really want to act as connectors to help bring these tables together.
Yeah, well, you see the email addresses that are listed there. If you're interested in plugging into some of these conversations that are taking place and want to be involved in these processes, reach out to Eduardo or I, and we will make sure to get you connected to the right people in each of those regions. So that if you want to have a seat at the table, we make sure that you are in touch with other folks who are co-organizing and putting that process together. We have time for maybe one more question before we move into the next segment of today's program. Let me just check the chat here, and if not, we will we'll move into our breakout portion of the agenda. It looks like we covered every question in the chat. Anybody else want to ask one last question? Okay, well, with that, we'll move into the next portion of the agenda, which is our breakout discussions. We are gonna encourage you all to contribute to the conversations in these smaller groups. We'll allot 15 minutes for conversation, and then we'll give 5 minutes for someone to self-designate from each of the groups and report out some of the high-level talking points that came out of the discussion from each of the groups, and then we'll go from there. We're going to ask that you follow the following, take note of the following instructions that are going to be here on your screen on how to select a group. And so we can go to the next slide. You're going to go to the breakout room icon at the bottom of your screen. And from there, you are going to be asked to select one of the groups based on the geography that you and your organization represent. And so you will click on the blue join button to select the geography that is applicable to you. And from there, you will join the other folks on today's program from that same geography. And then we will have a couple of prompting questions that we'll share with you here in a second that we're going to ask all of you to discuss for 15 minutes. And then when you'll get some reminders in terms of how much time is left while you're in your groups. And then if you need assistance, there's there's the instructions there for you to request assistance from one of our team members who can then help you with that piece of the breakout process. And we are dropping now in the chat the breakout room questions, and they're also here on your screen. And so in a couple minutes here, we're going to ask for you to follow the process for going into the breakouts. But we want you to keep in mind these 2 questions. What does current economic development activity look like in your community? What does that consist of right now in the region that you represent, the communities that you represent? And then the second question is, how do you see yourself and or your organization engaging in this CERF process, and what support or technical assistance would you need to be able to do that meaningfully, whether it's for yourself or the organization? And so keep those two questions in mind as you go into your breakout questions. There will be a facilitator to help folks move the conversation along in each of the breakout groups. And then we will have a note taker to help as well. And so if you have any questions while you're in the session in the breakout groups, let either one of our two folks know, and we'll be happy to answer those questions for you. So with that, let's go ahead and get into the breakout sessions. We'll give you a couple minutes to follow those instructions, go down to the breakout groups icon, and then look for the region that's yours. And then we'll see you in the breakout groups shortly. Thank you all for participating and contributing to those breakout discussions, and those of you who contributed and who were taking notes, really appreciate it. We have a few minutes here through 12:55 to do some really brief report outs of what we heard in each of the sessions. And so I will invite David Loaiza from our session, my colleague, to maybe do a quick report out from our session, and then we'll go from there.
Yes. Hi, everyone. So in our group, we sort of hit on three different areas in Southern California. We hit the southern border, East LA, and also Orange County. And close to the southern border, the biggest source of a big contributor to the economy has been historically agriculture. And this has, the Latino community has played an important role in agriculture. One thing that was highlighted there is that Latinos haven't been at the center of economic development historically in these conversations. So it's a region that needs a lot of support in terms of just thinking about the future and what comes next. In Orange County, there's a big focus in preventing displacement. So a lot of the service community and a lot of Latinos that work in the service industry were impacted. So there's a lot of effort to prevent displacement, focusing on housing that is affordable. And in East LA, there's also a big focus in helping to address the issue of that, a lot of the Latino community has historically have not had access to high paying jobs. So trying to address some of the issues there and find opportunities to connect Latino community with high paying jobs in the technology industry. Ish, in case I missed anything, I'll pass it over to you.
No, I think you captured most of it. There was the just with Orange County, reminding people to think beyond Disneyland and the tourism industry. There's other sectors down there that contribute a lot to the economy, which Latinos play a strong hand in. And then in Imperial County, we were reminded about the potential that's on the horizon with the development of the lithium industry down there, and the hope and that the Latino community will play a strong role in the prosperity that project brings. So I appreciate everybody who contributed. Let's pass it now to Annalisa to report on the Central Coast.
Thanks, Ish. We had a really robust discussion in our group around, what's going on now, and then what folks are building and hoping to see. As far as where they see or how they see economic development right now, a lot of talk about the programs that are there, especially around rental assistance, and other programs are hard to navigate for folks, right? They're not as accessible, loopholes that make it difficult for families to access the help that they need. And also make it difficult for folks to pay back to family members or for other loans around rental assistance. So there's an opportunity there, especially with looking at our undocumented communities in the Central Coast. Talked also about just the growth in building and construction trades in the area, and how a lot of the organizations in our group were really looking at what is the opportunity to take a look at those jobs and train and retrain folks to enter that space, and to make sure that those are providing a living wage and opportunities for folks, pathways of opportunity. For the second question, there was a lot of talk on retraining first, looking at connecting with community colleges, employers in the region, to making sure that we're training for good jobs that will be in the region. in a variety of ways, but especially looking at how to take a critical look at agriculture, hospitality, and construction. And then last, we kind of ended on this conversation about entrepreneurship as a pathway to small business ownership, the role that it plays there, and the needs around that. So flexible capital, culturally competent technical assistance, vocational training, that's kind of based in innovation, and really investment for folks to make it easy to enter these kind of areas, especially when it comes to skill development for folks and training in a way that helps folks see their path forward in the community.
Great, thank you, Annalisa. I'm going to pass it on now to our friend Katia from the Latino Community Foundation to give a quick report out from her group.
Yeah, so we were part of the Northern California group, and our group highlighted that the Bay Area is such a large region and so diverse when it comes to having suburban or urban communities. And there's such a diverse population, but despite that, a lot of our orgs saw the same crossover in the needs of the community, like lack of access to housing, access to education, and well-paying jobs. So they are excited to collaborate on this. And in terms of collaboration in CERF, someone mentioned the importance of building on what's already working and the programs that are already a part of the orgs and not creating more work for their staff. So I think that's really a really good point to underscore for the rest of the folks on this call. We want to make sure that you're not creating a whole new program or a whole new piece of work for all of you to engage in this. Like, there's so many things that you all are already doing that could really mesh well with CERF and be part of this program.
Thank you, Katia. And last but certainly not least, we'll turn to Eduardo.
Hi, folks. So from the Central California Breakout, in response to the first question, folks mentioned some pretty traditional sectors of the economy, right? Agriculture, hospitality, as being sort of key drivers that will, for economic growth, that will need to be addressed in CERF. There was discussion about existing partnerships with foundations to help build inclusive economies, right? So specifically the Salinas Inclusive Economic Development Initiative was one of them. There was also something that was mentioned was a desire to give promotoras equitable pay and long-term, basically to include them in the process of creating long-term sustainable solutions to addressing healthcare gaps, right? And ensuring that these workers are being paid and being paid what they deserve. There was also, just moving quickly to the second question, when it comes to what groups need to engage in CERF, the first thing that came up was the importance of immigration reform and ensuring that basically just naming what some of the most disenfranchised groups face in being a part of regional economic development that's equitable, right? But also technical assistance came up, data, and also making sure that the voices of the most excluded workers are a part of these discussions. So specifically referring to farm worker communities, undocumented communities, and immigrants as well. And something else that came up was a desire for there to be study and internship opportunities, right? So that folks have some training or gain some experience in some of the emerging sectors in the economy.
Gracias, Eduardo. Really appreciate the thoughtfulness that all of you put into these breakout discussions. Really appreciate the insights and feedback, and I'm glad that we're recording this because we'll capture it and it'll be made available after today's event. And with that said, let me just walk us through briefly before we wrap up some next steps after today. We certainly don't want this to be the only touch point that we have with all of you regarding CERF. Our hope is that you will reach out with additional questions with the desire to get connected to these conversations in the regions that you operate in. And we certainly want to make ourselves available to do that and assist you with that process. As we mentioned in the chat and mentioning here, this recording, along with all the questions that were answered and those that were unanswered, will be captured, and it'll all be hosted on the website you see there that's available on the screen. and dropped in the chat. Specifically, it's calcerf.org, calcerf.org is where we'll have all the materials housed for today's event. There's also a link on the screen there for the state's website. Especially in the next couple months, I strongly encourage you all to monitor and keep an eye on the developments that come out of the state regarding this program. I mentioned earlier, there'll be an opportunity for public comment and another round of guidelines. There'll be information on state workshops that will be available in each of the regions. Keep an eye on that website as well, so that you're up to speed on what the state's developments are with the program. And then lastly, we want to hear from you on how today's session was, if it was helpful to you, if it was not, if there are others that you want to be included in this process and should be, this information should be available to. Fill out the survey. It takes a couple minutes. It was just dropped in the chat by my colleague, Sarah. We'd love to hear from you on how today's session went and also how we can be of further assistance to you moving forward. And last but not least, reach out to Eduardo or I with any follow-up questions you may have. You know, anything we can do to assist in connecting you. We're here to support you in that effort. And with that said, I want to just thank you all for your time. And I want to turn it over to my colleagues, Eduardo and Katia, to close us out. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Ish. Thanks everyone for joining and for being a part of this discussion. You have our contact information. Please be in touch with any questions you may have or any comments you may have about how this session went. You know, there's a lot of information that we shared, but the conversation doesn't end here. So please be in touch. And again, thank you so much for all the work that you do on behalf of California's Latino community.